So, very welcome to our first Good Food Collective talk live here on Zoom. We are, what shall I say, we're super excited, proud and happy to welcome the one and only Rupert Read as our guest. Welcome, Rupert.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here in this way.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for us too, a very big one. So today we would have the first conference of the Good Food Collective, which is due to the current situation postponed to October 17th. But nevertheless, I just want to take the chance to say some brief words about the Good Food Collective, which is actually an association for the joyful turnaround in food. So all the members share the vision of a solidary and ecological world, led by example, like our initiators Laura, Gernot and Salem with their companies Conflict Food and Selo. And if you look briefly, I say to table, which means it's a collective of companies, NGOs, activists, artists, and chefs. So I would say for more information for everybody listening, you can go to the website on goodfoodcollective.de. Me, for myself, I am Sarah Rebecca Gerstner, and I'm very happy that I can team up tonight with the sensational Kai Stechtele. And I'm really, really happy that I can talk to all of you guys tonight. So please, Kai, it's your turn.
So, dear Rupert, what we want to do with you, not only you, but also now around 40 members in our talk, is to discuss not only with you about the COVID-19 situation in London and the UK right now, and the messages of this state of emergency we can decrypt when we are willing to do so, but also, of course, we want to speak about the climate crisis and about the connection between the crisis 1 with the crisis 2, and discuss where, from your point of view, the connections are. And because the Good Food Collective tries to encourage us to take change in our own hands, and not only hands, but also in our throats, we want to speak with you about the connection between the climate crisis and food and flourishing. And at the end, we, of course, have to discuss about what kind of action will be needed in the phase to come in the next years, decades, centuries, because this is a crucial time, a historical time of the last 2000 years. And now it's up to us to start action even more powerfully than we did in the last year. And for all of you which are now taking part in that talk, our aim is that we will discuss every, let's say, chapter for around 10 minutes, and every one of you is, of course, invited to ask questions as well. So what we are doing is we will have an eye on the chat window on the at least in my computer right corner. And please send questions, discuss with us, and we want to include as many questions as possible in our talk. So, dear Rupert, we want to start now with the most important question, at least for me, which is, what are you wearing under the screen?
Yeah. So one of the great things about this new world we're living in is one has the opportunity to be very smart here, but to wear anything one likes, slow it down. Yeah, absolutely. It's very good to be here with you in this innovative way. And I thank you for having this conversation with me in English, which will be a lot more illuminating than if we tried to have the whole thing in German. And I look forward to the topic because it's so important.
Yeah, let us know about the situation in the UK right now in terms of COVID-19 and how you are coping with the crisis right now.
Yeah, so the situation here, unlike in Germany, is pretty disastrous. In Germany, you have a lot of intensive care beds, and you've had some quite effective responses to the emerging pandemic. Here we have few intensive care beds, far fewer than you have, and also few ventilators and very little equipment, protective equipment relative to the need for that equipment. And we have a government which has had the most astoundingly useless or counterproductive policies until quite recently. They have not followed at all the precautionary principle, which I'm sure is a principle familiar to most of you, principle that originated, of course, in Germany. And this has been my main argument against the government over the last month, that they haven't tried to keep ahead of the pandemic. Instead, they basically, for a while, more or less allowed it to let rip. And this was a catastrophic mistake, which is now taking people's lives. So we are now on a lockdown here. It's not as full, in my opinion, as it should be. We're still letting, to give one example, construction workers continue to work, even when their construction work has got nothing to do with any emergency. And we're going to pay the price for all of this very dearly. So it's a terrible time, and we have to try to learn from this, and we have to try to make sure that the learning applies to this crisis, to similar future crises, and to any crisis, including, of course, the climate and ecological emergency. So I'm speaking to you from Norwich. I was in London for the last time about 10 days ago, when things were starting to get, quite hairy there. And we are now in a situation in the UK where some of our hospitals are now overwhelmed, and old patients and ill patients are being refused ventilators and are dying. That is now starting to happen here.
But did you leave London because of pandemic reasons?
So I live in Norwich. I was in London having a couple of media opportunities and meetings, and my wife was in London, so I was visiting with her, and now she and I are both here in Norwich. You're very quiet, by the way.
Yeah.
What do you mean quiet?
I mean, your voice has suddenly gone to a much lower volume since you removed your earpiece.
So then, I thought I could get rid of the earphones, but obviously that's not possible. So what I did in the last days was to read some smart pieces in blogs, but also in newspapers, about the connection between the loss of biodiversity, the climate crisis on the one hand, and the pandemic on the other. So you are a professor of philosophy. You have been an activist. You have been a member in the Green Party. You decided to go out to the streets because you were so desperate about what was or was not going on in the last years and decades. So from your point of view, what is there to read, to decrypt from that phase we are going through right now?
Yeah, so that's, of course, the crucial question. There is so much to say about it. I've been trying to write a little of what there is to say about it. And among the other people I would recommend to read about this are Nafeez Ahmed, my colleague Jem Bendel, my colleague Nassim Taleb, and his colleagues in the States are also writing very important things about this from a precautionary perspective. The thing I'd like to focus on initially, because it's so close to your concerns, is the crucial relevance of food to all of this. So let's start with the fact that as far as we can tell, it's probable that the virus came from wildlife markets in China, where people are, in many cases, eating the wildlife concerned. That the virus probably came from beings that were ripped from their natural environment, which is being damaged and stressed in this wildlife market. And there's a lesson there, right? Just in terms of simple stuff to do with not destroying ecology and not abusing non-human animals. And the lesson is not specific to China, not by any means. This is happening all over the world, including in your country and my country. So the pandemic started in a food-related context, But in a way much more important than that is the relevance of food to the pandemic as it's now underway. And what I mean by saying that is that the pandemic is exposing the food system that we have as a very dangerous food system. It's a just-in-time system around most of the world. An awful lot of our food system is run through multinational companies, through for-profit, of course. It's distributed through vast networks across vast areas with enormous cost in terms of carbon emissions, of course. Distributed primarily through supermarkets, which run, as I say, a just-in-time system. They do not retain large stocks. This means that they don't have much of a buffer. They don't have much of a contingency for crises like this one. And I'm not sure what this is like in Germany. I think it's less bad than it is in the UK. But in the UK, the part of the result of this is that predictably, we're getting significant food shortages in a lot of our shops here, because people are worried as they go into lockdown, and they're worried as they go into this pandemic, and they are stocking up. And that's, you know, a predictable and in many ways reasonable response. So a very harsh light is being shed here on our food system. This is an argument that that I've been making, and many people have been making for months, for years, for decades even, about our food system. But we are now getting a real lesson in that. And it is so important that we learn this lesson. The lesson about the importance of shortening supply lines, of becoming more food self-sufficient, more food secure, more food sovereign, about growing more of our own food, about wasting less food, about eating lower on the food chain, all things that are familiar, I'm sure, to you and the people that you work with, but that are now starting to gnaw at the consciousness of the wider population and of governments because of the stress that our food system is now coming under. It is vital that we learn these lessons, because the same kinds of shocks are going to come, and probably worse, in the years ahead as the climate and ecological situation worsens, which it will definitely do for a while, even if organizations like Extinction Rebellion start to triumph, because of the time lags and the feedbacks that there are in the system.
So from my point of view here in Germany, this discussion is almost not visible. Yeah. I read interviews, as I said, and articles, but people are thinking about, this is Germany, toilet paper, about do we hurt civil rights or not, which is an important discussion, of course. But it's almost impossible right now to stress that debate, which is crucial not only for the situation now, but also for the times to come. What do you think is the reason for that people, because it's so shocking what is happening right now, are not willing to deep into that source of the pandemic we are facing right now?
Yeah. So I think what you're really referring to is the fact that right now many people are scared and are in a new situation, and that is totally understandable. And I think the first thing we have to do is to be honest about that ourselves and express our own fears and not try to hide that, and to accept that right now people in the global north, people in countries like Germany and the UK, many of them are having their first ever experience of national emergency, or certainly global emergency, and their first ever experience really of a sense of a kind of shared vulnerability. To some people in the global south, this kind of experience is not so new, but to many of us, it's really new. Now, that means that it's, again, not surprising that people are, at the moment, not really necessarily seeing things terribly clearly. If you're focused on trying to get hold of some toilet paper and trying to get hold of some food from a supermarket, you're not in a very good position to have a detailed discussion about biodiversity, about wildlife markets, about global supply chains, etc. But this situation is going to change, right? Unless things get very, very bad very, very quickly. I mean, not just that many more people die, which is unfortunately tragically bound to happen, but that our societies actually start to disintegrate, which I think is unlikely as a result of this crisis. unless something really extreme happens, we will start to get used to this crisis. And although it's going to build and get worse for a while and get a lot worse, tragically in my country, as I say, avoidably to some significant extent, it will then probably reach a peak and it will then start to diminish. There may be waves of that. We may be in this for many months, possibly for years, but there will come times when people are more willing to look at the causes of this, are more willing to learn from it, are less in the immediate grip of it. And when those times come, for example, when we reach the moment, when we pass the moment of the peak of mortality, in countries like the UK. When those times come, then we need to be ready to have more systemic thinking available to people on the things that we are talking about. We need to be ready for the moments when people are willing to talk about reforming the food system and are understanding that it makes very, very little sense to have a food system which makes us so vulnerable, and that there is an opportunity to rebuild in a more intelligent way and make ourselves less vulnerable to future similar crises.
So Rupert, let me ask the question, how do you could or define your role in this system, or in just the prediction you just were talking about? So yeah, what would you say, what's your role gonna be? How could it look actually?
Okay, so in terms of my own position and my own expertise, if you will, so as you've mentioned, I'm a philosopher, and my specialty is increasingly in political philosophy and environmental philosophy, or eco-philosophy. And a lot of my work is quite applied these days, and I do things like I make presentations to groups of parliamentarians, and I speak to people in government and in various political parties, and I do that also in my role for Extinction Rebellion as well. Central to my own thinking and that of my colleagues such as Nassim Taleb, who I mentioned earlier, is the precautionary principle, which has not been observed, at least not in this country, with regard to this pandemic, and which has certainly not been observed with regard to the climate and ecological emergency, and which could be very transformative if we were to really think about how we can take care of the future, how we can look after ourselves, how we can guard against extreme threats. We would act very differently from the ways that we do act. I would also try to characterize myself, I guess, as a sort of a systems thinker. So I have my speciality, but part of my speciality, if you will, is looking at things in the round, looking at things broadly. I think sometimes our political system, and certainly our academic system, tends to suffer from over-specialization in countries like Germany and the UK, and more generally in modern culture. And I try to get into a position where I can look across those disciplinary walls and think about things in a systemic way. And again, in that way, I would say I'm on the same page as colleagues of mine, such as Jem Bendel, Nafiz Ahmed, Nassim Taleb. It's at times like these that we need specialists, of course, like the epidemiologists and the medical technicians, who we're all now getting a lot more familiar with, but we also need broad systems thinking to look at the kind of the deeper aspects of the threats we face, the knock-on effects of them. One of the reasons I think why my government has gone so badly wrong in the last several weeks is it relied on certain kinds of specialists. It relied on certain behavioral scientists and epidemiologists, and it didn't have people thinking clearly enough about the broader dimensions of the problem, to do with, for example, the vulnerability of the health service as a whole to being overwhelmed. And also something which has been very encouraging in my country over the past few weeks is that many of the ordinary people, the citizens, have been actually moving ahead of government in that way, and urging the government to move faster to take protective and precautionary measures, and taking those kind of measures ourselves, and preemptively cancelling events or moving events online and things like that. And by doing so, we'll have saved lives. So that's one of the good things which is coming out of this, the willingness of people to move ahead of their own governments when the governments are lagging behind where they should be.
So would you go even further and say that everybody has a responsibility, like each and every person actually, And how could this responsibility look also after we reached kind of the peak you were talking about, the pandemic?
Yeah, sure. I think that's right. Although I think another thing which is really important about the coronavirus situation is that we are learning here the importance of community and the importance of thinking in a way that goes beyond thinking individualistically. Because there is no way that we can protect ourselves purely individualistically against this pandemic. My health depends upon my neighbor's health. Ultimately, my health depends upon your health, and your health depends upon my health. This is a global pandemic. And if you don't move to protect yourselves as a community, as a society, as a group, then you will be vulnerable. In the early stages of the pandemic, I think a lot of people were thinking, well, right now, this is very unlikely to affect me personally, so I'll just carry on the same for a while. But that's, it turns out, is a really stupid way to think, a really reckless way to think. Because, of course, if everybody thinks that way, then we know for certain that the pandemic, which is contagious like this, highly contagious, will spread very fast. We need to think beyond our own individual selves. We need to think as a community. We need to think ultimately as a global community. And of course, this is something which is quite exciting in a way, in terms of the possibilities that are brought to us by the horror of this pandemic. What's quite exciting is that maybe we will learn to do that better. Maybe we will learn from the things that have gone wrong in this pandemic to think more about what we have in common with and how we depend upon people in China and people in Germany and so on and so forth. And if we do that, then we'll be putting ourselves into the kind of position which could enable us to step up and take the kind of serious global consciousness-oriented action which is absolutely required if we are to address the biodiversity emergency and the climate emergency, the longer emergencies which are there underlying the coronavirus situation.
So would you say that the virus actually shows us that we're able to act and to change for the first time, maybe?
Well, yeah, I would say something like that. And it's remarkable, isn't it, the way that everything is changing. So here are we on Zoom when you were going to be doing something in person. I wasn't actually going to be coming to that anyway, because I don't fly anymore, and it's a long way to take the train to Germany, although I have done it. But yeah, you are now meeting virtually. I am here in Norwich in this lockdown. A third of the world is locked down. Governments around the world have put together these enormous economic packages, absolutely so vast. You know, governments have been saying, many of them for years, oh, there's not enough money for what you want to do on climate. There's not enough money for what you want to do on ecology, or for the way you want to revolutionize the food system. Well, it turns out there is enough money, right? And they'll never be able to make that excuse again. And yeah, we're learning about our global connectivity through this virus. So yeah, in a number of ways, it's clear that everything is changing and that there are further potential changes available to us. We must learn from this. We don't have time to mess around, because this pandemic is very serious. There may be more serious ones following it. And the ongoing long climate and ecological emergency is ultimately going to be even more serious and will put even more human lives and other lives at risk. So yeah, I think we're learning, and I think the possibilities are there for a deeper learning. We must seize those possibilities. We must be thinking about that now. We must be acting accordingly, and we must be ready for those moments that will come in the coming weeks and months when it's possible to make further changes. And for example, to influence what's happening in our own countries and in the EU in terms of how we rebuild out of this crisis. It's vital, for example, that we don't abandon the European Green Deal, which some extremely foolish hard right politicians in Europe are saying we should abandon now because they're desperately worried about the state of the economy. But you know what? What this crisis, I believe, is really teaching us is that there's something that's even more important than the economy, and that's people's lives. You know, governments like my government and the Trump government and some of the governments around Europe are putting people's lives at risk by trying to keep the economy moving, as it were, right now. But I think we will reject that, and we will say, no, actually, you don't get to kill my parents just because you want to keep your economy going for another week.
But don't you think that there is like also might be a problem that like after the crisis, if we can like even think from nowadays to that point, that the crashing economy would also cause like at the final end mortality, like if it hits people so hard that it also causes like or even a bigger damage?
Well, no, I don't think so. For this reason, if this pandemic is allowed to let rip, which to say again was ridiculously the policy of my government until recently, it could kill hundreds of millions of people. Certainly, it may well kill tens of millions. Now, a global depression would be a terrible and a destructive thing, but it wouldn't kill hundreds of millions of people. It just wouldn't. You know, that didn't happen in the 1930s. You know, lots of unpleasant things happened, and people did die as a result of the Great Depression in the 1930s, but not hundreds of millions of people. The epidemic, exponential nature of a pandemic like this is something that has to be taken very, very seriously. But of course, you're right that a global pandemic is potentially very destructive to our economy, and that a global depression would not be something that should be welcomed. It's possible to stop a global depression, of course, in intelligent ways. So I mentioned the European Green Deal. We need to have a just transition. We need to have a Green New Deal across Europe and across the world. And that's part of what we should be building towards, arguing for, especially after the peak of infections comes. It has to be done right. It shouldn't be thought of as just a way of restarting economic growth or re-stimulating the economy. It should be thought of more as a way of taking us to a way of living which is less destructive in the first place. You know, it's the desperate rush for economic growth which has put us into the terrible situation of the climate and ecological emergency in the first place. It's the desperate rush to economically globalize, which has helped to create the coronavirus pandemic. Let's be very, very clear about this. For example, on top of the things I've already said, let's be very clear that this pandemic would not be happening, or at least would not be nearly as bad, if we didn't have mass global air travel. And if we hadn't failed to rein in that mass global air travel as soon as we learned about this pandemic. You know, people around the world, many countries now, even states, are closing their borders. If we'd done that in a more intelligent, more focused way 2 or 3 months ago, we wouldn't be having some of the people dying right now who are dying right now. The Spanish flu pandemic was the last comparable pandemic 100 years ago. And back then you didn't really have air travel. So Spanish flu traveled slowly. You know, it traveled at the speed of steamships and so on. When you've got a pandemic traveling at the speed of jet planes, you know, that's a recipe for disaster. So let's be intelligent about this. Let's really learn from this, and let's not just try to recreate economic globalization. Let's not just try to recreate economic growth. Let's try to create a food system which, as I say, is much more locally based and more locally resilient. I think the real kind of challenge which this pandemic presents us with, but it's one that I think we can now rise to, is how do we think globally and act locally? And that's a classic environmentalist slogan, but it's now becoming really, really true. We need to act more locally. We need to make ourselves more resilient locally in terms of food and other stuff. But we need to be ready also to think globally in terms of things like how to prevent pandemics, how to prevent global climatic breakdown.
So now we reached halftime, unfortunately. I thought we would need 3 hours with you, but unfortunately we only have 1 hour. So this is halftime. We have now 61 members in our talk, or guests in our talk. So for every one of you who is new, This is Rupert Read, one of the masterminds of Extinction Rebellion, professor of philosophy, and our guest for the first talk of Good Food Collective. And if you have a question, please feel very free to write your question in the chat, and we will ask that. So I want to draw you now from the huge discussion to how we can change the food system. Discussion we had in the last years all over the time was, what can I do? I understand you, Rupert, act on a local basis and take your responsibility. Then someone else is saying, okay, come on, I only want to have a proper piece of meat or cheese or bread on my table. What can I do to change the system against multinational companies about these huge structures which are much more powerful than I can ever be? So in this fight, individual responsibility and the big powers on the other hand, which developed over decades now, what is your main thought to take the first step into that struggle we have upon of us?
Yeah, well, as you know, the subject is complex. I think it's very difficult to pick out one main thought. So I've mentioned some of the things which are important already. Clearly, we ought to be eating lower on the food chain. I'm not necessarily saying that people have to go vegan, but clearly it would be very good for some of us to go vegan and for more of us to eat more vegan and for less of us to eat meat, especially industrialized meat. And that's one aspect of the thing. I also mentioned the importance of reducing food waste. You know, there is an astonishing amount of food waste in countries such as Germany and the UK. And we could become more locally food resilient and food self-sufficient if we reduced that food waste. But the really big challenge, in a way, is what we started out talking about some time ago, the whole food system, the just-in-time system, the system with very long supply lines, the industrialized food production system, and the industrialized food distribution system. And that's what I want to really home in on as the problem. And of course, you're right, it's such a big thing, it's really hard to get your head around. But in a way, it's possible to get your head around it when you consider the alternative. And the alternative, as we know, is things like community-supported agriculture. The alternative is small holdings, organic agriculture, permaculture, agroforestry. The alternative is people growing food on their allotments and in their back gardens and having local food supply hubs. And we can imagine that, I think, relatively clearly. And we can see the importance of that more now, I think, in the middle of a crisis like this one, when we're suddenly worried about the integrity of our long food supply lines. So that's what I want to suggest, that there's a kind of antithesis here between the system that we've got, which is mostly reliant on industrial food production and industrial food distribution across vast distances with all sorts of damaging effects, and the system that we need, which will be a system which is much more local, much more within people's reach, much more within people's sight, much more in people's backyards, and where people have an incentive to make sure that they grow food, for example, in ways which are not polluting and damaging. And that's the kind of direction of travel we need to move in, from the industrialized mega system to a system which is more on a human scale and localized all over the world. And I think that is something which we can imagine, and we know the ways to start to change it, although it won't be possible to change it completely without action at some quite high levels and without, broadly speaking, political action. That means either action through the electoral system and the standard political system, or it means action beyond that, such as the nonviolent direct action that groups like Extinction Rebellion take in order to try to move the whole debate and move the whole agenda and make things which seemed to be marginal come to the center stage. And that, of course, is becoming possible now, again, with this coronavirus crisis. People used to tell us in Extinction Rebellion, they used to say to us, your demands are impossible, they're outrageous, the timescales are extreme. But now we're seeing vast changes taking place in the economic and political system within a matter of weeks or even days. So that kind of thing that people used to say to us, well, that's no longer valid, no longer viable. And we have the opportunity now, whether we're food activists or whether we're in organizations like Extinction Rebellion or whether we're standing for parliament, whatever we're doing, we have the opportunity now to say, we have proved in this crisis that we're willing to make massive interventions where necessary to save lives or to save economies. So let's do that now with regard to the food system. Let's do it as we come out of this crisis. Let's do it to stop the next crisis.
We have two questions which are strongly connected. People are asking, we have a trade system all over the globe, also including countries who are which are dependent on production of food and exporting it, because people are earning their living on that trade. So what can we do? And some members in our Good Food Collective are working with these countries to import food from there to support people in their region. So when we start now to act like you are recommending us, what can we do to not leave these people and these countries behind?
Yeah, so that's a great question, of course, and a very important question. Again, there are many aspects to it. I'll home in on a few. One way that we should support the countries which we have been, let's take an example. So maybe we're buying flowers from Kenya that are flown in, or green beans from Kenya that are flown in. Rather than doing that, we should move to support those countries in other ways. What would those ways be? Well, one obvious way, obvious at this moment in history with this coronavirus crisis, is we ought to be cancelling the debt of those countries, because it's the debt of those countries that forces them to engage in a lot of economic activity that they should not necessarily be needing to engage in. Another thing that we can do is, of course, to give aid to those countries, foreign aid. Another thing that we can do, or another aspect of that, is to give technology to those countries. I'm talking about free technology transfer, for example, free transfer to those countries of solar panels. Now, one reason why the current crisis that we're in, the corona crisis, is showing how it makes sense to do these kinds of things, because these are generous acts, right? But they're acts which we should undertake for the good of those countries, and because we've treated them badly in the past, and also because it's in our rational self-interest. The coronavirus crisis is showing us the way that we are all interconnected, the way that the health of people in one country depends to some extent on the health of people in other countries, and the same within countries, and so on and so forth. So if we actually want to have a world which is going to be a good world and a just world, and a world that is going to work for ourselves, a world that is not going to break down, a world that is not going to generate new, more horrible diseases which will rage through populations which are insufficiently protected against them, then what we ought to be doing for the sake of the people in those countries, and for our own sake and for everybody's sake, is acting with justice, is acting with intelligence, and looking to find ways of putting those countries on a path to greater self-reliance. Yeah, that's what we ought to be doing. We ought to be helping people in countries where we've been buying food from those countries to be more self-sufficient themselves, and to be able to live well, to be able to live better themselves, without having to depend on doing stupid things like getting them to grow flowers for us, putting those flowers in planes and flying those planes over here.
Rupert, what you are describing is such a huge struggle on so many levels. It's almost impossible to imagine that we can win at least a little part of that struggle. What it's a personal question now to you, because I'm just curious, what are you doing to not lose your hope, to stay optimistic? Because like I said, you are in these kind of struggles now for decades. At the end of a long journey, you decided, now I will go out on the streets, I will be with Extinction Rebellion in blockades. I saw debates on BBC where people almost screamed at you that these are not the appropriate methods to raise awareness. So what is, my personal question to you, what is your way of not losing your optimism in that struggle?
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a great question. So I'm going to say two things in response. Firstly, I'm going to say that it's true to say that I don't have a great deal of hope that anything like the system that we have can be saved. So I think it's necessary to spend quite a lot of one's time and one's effort preparing for the potential decline or decay of this system or this civilization. And that's why I put quite a lot of my intellectual energy and practical energy into what's called adaptation rather than just prevention and mitigation. Adaptation to the deterioration in our climate and in our ecology, which is virtually certain to occur. And we need to face reality very resolutely and be courageous enough to admit that things are almost certainly going to, on balance, get worse for quite a long time to come, possibly forever. And quite a lot of what we need to do needs to be directed towards making things get less worse than they would otherwise get. So that's the first thing, and it may not seem to you very optimistic. It's just realistic. The second thing I want to say is that the remarkable thing about humanity is that as things get worse, they always contain within them the seeds of their getting better again. Because as we go into a crisis situation, as we go into a disaster, we have the capacity to respond to that boldly and to feel stuff we didn't feel before, and to be bigger than we were before, and to take, in a certain sense, more risks than we did before. For example, the risk of getting arrested, which really is quite a small risk compared to what people risk in other countries in similar situations. So what I'm getting at here, of course, is that in relation to the climate and ecological crisis, Extinction Rebellion was born because people were prepared to go further than they had done before because the situation was so bad. So because the situation was so bad, it spawned Extinction Rebellion, and then Extinction Rebellion is starting to make the situation less bad. So there's a kind of dialectical process between this terrible situation and a response we make to it that makes it better. And in relation to this coronavirus crisis, it's absolutely appalling. It's horrific. It's especially horrific to look at what my government is doing. But what is also true, I'm getting some echo now. What is also true is that this situation, the badness of this situation, is, as we were discussing a few minutes ago, making things possible that were not possible before. And so actually I've got a little bit of hope from this coronavirus situation. Wow, if governments can really find those trillions of euros, just like that, to deal with this situation, then there must be some chance that we can direct those trillions of euros over time into protecting ourselves and defending ourselves against what's coming, and not continue to be as stupid as we have been, and not continue to be as stupid as people are, very obviously being right now in the United States, for example. The people who are changing and breaking environmental laws and regulations in the United States. So you see what I'm getting at? I think on the one hand, we have to be very, very honest about how bad the situation is, and that changes what we do. But on the other hand, if we are very honest about that, and we are kind of as a global community finding some fresh honesty about that in relation to coronavirus, if we are honest about it, it makes exciting new things possible. So even though the situation is very desperate, I actually have a little bit more hope now than I had, say, 3 years ago.
My last question in that section is connected to Fred Gold, because he says these perspectives are great and valuable, but how do you counter the argument of food must be cheap and affordable, which is a crucial one, of course, for people without a big account with loads of money?
Yeah. So there's a number of aspects to this. One is that, of course, we have to try to, as I said, to do some of this one way or another through politics, through local government, and so on. We have to try to find ways of ensuring that food is available for everybody and not just for the better off. I mean, quality food. Now, one way of doing that, which I think we should mention during this moment of global crisis, and here in the UK, where I'm speaking to you from, certainly of national crisis, is the possibility of food rationing. You know, why should food be a commodity that we buy and sell in the marketplace? Food is a necessity. And right now, there are quite a lot of people in my country who are struggling to find that necessity, because they go to the supermarket and the shelves are stripped bare. And they don't really want to spend much time there anyway, because they're worried about getting coronavirus if they stay in that environment with a lot of people. Let's consider radical possibilities and radical solutions at this time. In the United Kingdom in World War II, we had food rationing, and it made people healthier and it made people more equal, and it lasted for a long time actually after the war ended. Maybe in this emergency we should think about doing something like that again, and that would answer Fred's question. What I would also say is that we should be deliberately working to try to, on a more local scale, we should be deliberately working to try to make the things which some of us participate in, things like community-supported agriculture, to make them more available to everybody. And I have some colleagues here in Norwich who are doing that, who have, for example, set up a community-supported agriculture scheme in one of the housing estates a couple of miles away from, well, just a mile away really, from where I live, which is where a lot of less well-off people, a lot of working class people, unemployed people, etc. live. And it's wonderful to make the opportunity of growing food available to everybody, including the people who actually need it the most. And that's something that we can contribute to. So I think there's a number of ways in which we can respond to that question. It's certainly a very important one.
So I would also like refer to Lisa's question here in the chat, and also like go even more into the climate change questions. So she's asking actually, how can each single one of us go into action to fasten the process of changing food system according to climate change? So is this also our new opportunity, new chance?
Yeah, so what to say about that? I mean, I guess let's start off by reminding ourselves that dangerous climate change is going to threaten all of our food systems, and that we should be very concerned about that. And what we're experiencing with coronavirus is just really like in this way, a sort of small test of much bigger tests and potential disasters that are going to come down the road during the next decade. And we need to be trying to make ourselves resilient against all of that. And how do we do that? There's a number of ways. One is by making our food system more fit for purpose in some of the ways we've been discussing. For example, reducing food waste, reducing the consumption of meat. Another way is that we ought to be planning for the tougher weather and hotter weather, which is likely to be occurring over the next 10 to 20 years. So that means, for example, that we ought to be thinking about having crop diversification, such that our crops are more resilient to different temperatures, to higher temperatures, to worse weather conditions. And again, what that really means is that we ought to be thinking about food less as a commodity and more as a necessity. And we ought to be thinking about food from the perspective not just of the role that it plays, therefore, in the economy, but in the role it plays in keeping us alive, as well as, of course, happy and enjoying ourselves. and so on, in the ways that we human beings love to do with food. So I think that those are some of the ways into this, that we can think about this on a very small scale, but ultimately it also needs to be thought about in terms of larger scale matters. What crops are farmers growing? Do we have enough crop diversification? Are we maintaining? One of the things which is troubling about our food system is the way that it's gone so close to being monocultural, and that we've lost a lot of old food varieties and seed varieties and so on. We need to be trying to bring those back at this time, because some of them will offer us good tools to be using in a world which is subject to a more chaotic climate.
So another question concerning or considering the climate change. So we're talking about all the chances the corona crisis could bring. So to me, it sounds like, yeah, so let's change the climate too, and everything is going to be all right. But then recently, I read a couple of articles where it actually says that through the corona crisis, the climate protection is even more irrelevant, because the federal government is pushing like all the attention and actually finally the money in the economy. So what do you think about this statement, or actually?
Yeah. So we've already touched on that, haven't we? But it's so important. Let's go into it a little bit more deeply. Yeah. I think the most powerful response that we can make to that, and I think we must make this response, is to say, look, haven't you really learned anything from the coronavirus crisis? The reason why we were willing to lock cities down and so on is because we wanted to save the lives of our old and our vulnerable, right? And because we're human beings, because we're trying to be human, because we're trying to be humane, because we're trying to be good. And let's not forget about that. And let's make sure that the economy is not a god that we worship, but the economy is there to serve us and to serve this more important central goal of loving each other and caring about each other and doing the right thing with regard to each other. Let's ask this question: what's the best way of building a memorial to the people who are dying right now and who are going to die in much larger numbers in the coming days and weeks and months? Is the best way to memorialize them to just flip back to business as usual and have the same commuting patterns and the same economic globalization and the same desperate search for GDP growth? Or is the best way to memorialize them to try to create a different system which is less likely to come along and bite us with a new pandemic, or less likely to come along and knock us out with dangerous climate change and with ecological destruction? So yeah, as we've said, there are many forces in our society which are going to try to say, oh my God, you know, we've stopped all this economic activity, we've got to resume it at all costs. We should sacrifice environmental protections in order to do that. But those voices are incredibly short-term voices, incredibly stupid voices, unwise voices. And they are voices which are not really thinking about and not really caring about human beings or other beings on this planet, certainly not caring about the young. And there is something which is quite intergenerationally interesting about this. So it's very striking that Extinction Rebellion is, and even more so, the school climate strikes have had a lot of young people in them. And obviously the school climate strikes, the clue's in the name, school climate strikes. And Greta Thunberg has become a worldwide figure. This is because the climate degradation and the ecological destruction threatens young people the most, because they're going to have to live in this ecologically degraded world. So with the corona crisis, it's mainly the old who are vulnerable. And with the climate and ecological crisis, it's mainly the young who are vulnerable. So if we save the old in the corona crisis, if we really do our best to try to keep our parents and our grandparents and the ill and the vulnerable alive, if we try to save our elders there, and if we have some success in that, as hopefully we will, is it possible that then, as we emerge from the coronavirus crisis, that we could switch our attention to trying to save the young people? And again, you know, it seems to me that that some of the old people who are dying and who will die in this crisis, if they could be asked, what would you like the world to be like after you've gone? I'm quite certain that what they would say is, well, I want it to be a good place for my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. So that's why we must absolutely make sure that we don't allow these environmental protections to be destroyed. It would be the most terrible thing if we emerged from the coronavirus crisis and just made the climate crisis even worse.
Rupert, there is a question by Fred Gold, and I think this is a crucial one for our debate. I'm not familiar with the situation in the UK, but you spoke, for example, about food rationing, which sounds fantastic on the one hand, but on the other hand, in Germany at least, people will scream, this is a fight against my personal freedom, not only by personal freedom, but also my freedom as being a producer. And we have huge powers in Germany. A politician called Marco Bülow calls it profit lobbyists and profit lobbyists, who are doing nothing else but fight against change in any way, just to protect their business models. And not only business models, but also their paradigm in their head. So what do you think is there to be done to fight back these huge powers we have in our political debate?
Yeah. So again, I think the fundamental point is the same. I think we are being given some more power, emotional power, rhetorical power to do that through the situation that we're going through. There are some politicians in Germany and more in the UK and even more in the USA who are in effect saying we should sacrifice the lives of our parents and grandparents, of some of them, so that we can keep the economy going. This is, of course, incredibly short-sighted and stupid as an attitude, because actually, if you do not control this virus rigorously in the way they have done in countries like South Korea or China, then it simply scuppers your economy for a longer period. But even if that weren't true, this attitude would still, it seems to me, be completely unacceptable. And I think that's just obvious, actually, to the vast majority of people, that it's just not okay to say, well, if I have to kill some old people to increase economic growth and GDP, then I will do it. No, that's not acceptable. And what we're learning in this crisis is our vulnerability, our shared vulnerability, and how much it matters to us that our old people and our medically vulnerable people are not just terminated. So, what does that mean? What I think it means is that we have a real power in arguing back against these people who say, look, you've got to allow me to be as free as I wish in the consumption, production, purchase, etc. of food and of everything else, air travel, etc., etc. Surely what we're learning is that there are things that are more important than that kind of freedom. That actually having a decent society and having everybody having the basics and people staying alive and not being arbitrarily subject to death, that these things are more important than consumerist freedom. I'm not saying that freedom isn't important. For example, I think that political freedom is enormously important. What I'm saying is that the kind of freedom you exercise when you get to choose, there was a supermarket the other day being discussed on the radio, and they were saying we're simplifying the number of sausages we produce. We produce 60 kinds of sausages, but because of the coronavirus food crisis, we're going to reduce that dramatically. And I thought, wow, did we ever really need 60 different kinds of sausages? You know, is that kind of consumer freedom worth people potentially dying for? And I think, we're just realizing now that the answer is no, it's not. So I think we can fight back very strongly against people who now say, yes, but you can't infringe my freedom to buy whatever food I want or to fly wherever I want. I think our answer is, if your freedom to buy whatever food you want or to fly wherever you want comes at the cost of other people dying, then we can infringe your freedom to do that, and we should.
So, Rupert,
would you say, one more question, just hold on a second. Would you say that this is the new form or the new, actually appropriate form of protest in in the post-corona world? Or what's the appropriate protest in the post-corona world?
Yeah, well, look,
opinion?
right now things are very difficult, right? Right now things are very challenging. It's very difficult to do non-violent direct action when you're all locked down in your own homes. So
Exactly.
right now we're doing things like this and doing some digital activism and maybe taking a pause, learning and reflecting and preparing for what comes next. Once we start to be able to recirculate around the streets together and so on once again, well then there will be opportunities to use what we've learned, but also to go back to what was working last year or earlier this year. And you know, in Germany, you have a very noble tradition of political direct action and radical non-violent action, and so do we here in the UK. And I think that by the time it's possible again for us to do non-violent direct action on the streets, I think we'll be hungry for it, and I would urge everyone watching to get involved, because it is absolutely clear that there won't be any decent future unless more of us are willing to go a step further and to take risks with our own freedom. Again, there are things that are more important than freedom. You know, if by spending a few hours in a police cell, I can help to make a change for the better in my whole society, well, then that's worth it.
So, Rupert, you wrote yourself a comment in the chat about your book. I have two questions to that. The first one is, you mentioned articles you read in the last days. Please do us the favor and send us an email, and we will share the link with the people listening now to our chat, and also afterwards, because it's crucial now to read these articles, to highlighting these debates right now, and to push them. But the second question is, your book in English is This Civilization is finished. So
yeah, here it is.
You know, and it will be published in German. Do you know when?
No, I don't quite know when, but I think it's not going to be so very long now. They have finished the translation, and it's only a short book anyway. I think it's going to be within the next couple of months, but of course this may be affected by the crisis we're going through. It's a difficult time for book publishers.
Yeah, of course. But my question about the book is, what is your most beloved thought in that book? What is the thought you were the happiest person when you wrote it down?
That's a lovely question. I'm not sure what to say, but there is one particular passage in the book that I would like to read to you, because it's very pertinent to the conversation that we've been having. This is where, at the start of the book, on page 4, I set out the 3 possibilities I see for our future, and they are as follows. Firstly, this civilization could manage somehow to transform itself deliberately, radically, and rapidly in an unprecedented manner in time to avert collapse. And that's what we hope we can do, right? Secondly, this civilization could manage to seed a future successor civilization as this one collapses. So the possibility I'm raising there is that if our civilization collapses, maybe a new one can emerge from the wreckage. Or finally, this civilization could collapse utterly and terminally. And this would be the worst outcome, right? As a result of climatic instability, leading, for instance, to catastrophic food shortages, or possibly sooner than that, through nuclear war or financial collapse leading to mass civil breakdown, or through pandemic. When I wrote that, you know, little did I know that we'd be here in this situation that we're in a year later. As I say, I don't think it's at all likely that coronavirus will lead to the end of our civilization, but it has reminded us very, very forcibly that there are multiple ways in which this civilization could collapse. It's reminded us of that forcibly because even though it's only killing a few percentage of the population, it's having enormous effects upon our world. And we do not know that there will not be a worse pandemic to come next year or in 10 years' time or something. And we do know that there are things that we do that make that more likely, or things that we could do that will make that less likely.
So Rupert, you told us you are invited for dinner, and we will not disturb your dinner. So it was a pleasure for us to have you on board. We didn't lose listeners in our chat, so this is a good sign. And the last words now go to Sarah.
Yeah, Rupert, thank you so very, very much. Enjoy your upcoming dinner. And I just want to remind or invite actually everybody of our listeners, viewers, and also like us to enjoy the Earth Hour, which starts at 8:30 and lets us like switch off our lights.
Yeah, very good. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this discussion. It's been really high quality. Thank you. And yes, I must now go and have dinner with my wife. I know that you understand the importance of food. So yeah, I'm going to do that. Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye to Norwich.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.